Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this European Issuers webinar on digitalization and how to facilitate its uptake by companies. So I will be moderating this session. Let me introduce myself first. So I'm I'm an attorney at law, Pierre Marsal, an attorney at law, and chairing the European Issuers Working Group on Securities Law and Market Infrastructures. Let me switch now to the four panelists who will intervene. First, Jan Sessens, head of the unit of digital finance, DG FISMA. I think Jan has difficulties connecting to the webinar for the time being. The second panelist will be Dr. Joachim Schwerin, who is principal economist at DG Grow. Third panelist is Agostino Nuzzolo, who is General Counsel Telecom Italia. And the fourth is Nathan Bertel, Senior Vice President of Sales Diligent. I would like to extend my thanks to Diligent for sponsoring this event, and this webinar will be structured as followed. So now a 10-minute presentation from Diligent, notably on cybersecurity. Then we'll have the panel discussion between 11:15 and 12, 3/4 of an hour, on four themes. And then we'll have the Q&A session for 15 minutes between 12 and 12:15. Nathan, the floor is yours.
Pierre, thank you very much. My name is Nathan Bertel, as Pierre mentioned. Diligent is delighted to sponsor this webinar and would like to, for the first 5 or 10 minutes, just give a sort of brief overview of some of the business challenges that we see organizations experiencing today. As Pierre mentioned, we're focused on a couple of things. One is cybersecurity. The other is the topic of stakeholder capitalism and ESG more generally, which is gaining a lot of traction, a lot of interest in the market. We ran an event recently about the future of work that featured Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, Betsy Atkins, who's external director on many public boards, and Carmen Di Sibilio, who is chairman and CEO of EY Global. And one of the things that was highlighted there is how digital transformation is having such an impact on organizations across the globe in terms of not just sustaining business, but maintaining competitive advantage. One of the things that was interesting to me the other day was I saw a statistic that said Booking.com, or the holding company of Booking.com, has a higher market capitalization these days than Marriott, Hilton combined. And when you think about the impact of the digital world and how it affects different industries and how companies can grow and thrive in that sort of environment, it seems to be lesson for all of us. And there are advantages to be taken by using digital effectively, and disadvantages for organizations that are not able to work in that manner. Before we continue, thought it would be a good idea to take a poll and get the view of the audience participants today. And really, we're interested in understanding what is your biggest challenge in operating digitally, or as you see, move towards digital transformations. And the options that you can vote on, and the poll is opening now, you'll see there are 4. Whether you find that improving investor and stakeholder confidence around ESG is top priority, whether it's cybersecurity and data breach as potential risks, the risk of non-compliance, and especially with the introduction of new regulatory frameworks, or whether it's the desire to increase board diversity and effectiveness across the organizations in which you operate. If you take the vote on that now, we'll come back and look at the results of that poll in a minute. But in the meantime, focus on challenges that we see that our clients are facing. And as we see greater, not only transformation to digital, but also a greater rise of stakeholder capitalism, one of the items that is of huge importance to organizations is improving brand equity and showing confidence in their investors around ESG and ESG performance. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail later on, but that as an issue is gaining traction and is becoming higher on C-suite board members and senior executives in organizations that we see. As organizations are becoming more distributed and operating globally, the number of entities they need to manage is rising, and the ability to remain compliant amongst all those different jurisdictions is something that we see challenging organizations as well. I'll focus on a couple more of these because in the interest of time, we won't go through each of them in turn. But remote working is becoming just a way of life. COVID pandemic in many ways accelerated the use of some technologies when it came to remote working. And that is not going to go away. One of the topics that was discussed in the seminar that I mentioned previously was to what extent workforces will operate in a hybrid fashion versus office-based. And the consensus of the panelists on that session was that we'll very much be operating in a hybrid world in future. And so having the technology and the infrastructure in place to support that is going to be important. The other thing that we see, and the last topic I'll talk about on this slide, is the need to enhance board composition and board effectiveness to embrace those new challenges that are coming up. And that's embracing the diversity of the expectations that a board is expected to support. And by diversity, I don't just mean diversity of gender or ethnicity, but diversity of experience, expertise, diversity of geographic knowledge as well. And we see organizations striving to show their diversity and embracing that in terms of senior executive board level appointments, and as I say, supporting diversity across all those different characteristics. Let's talk about a couple of those just in a little bit more detail. Firstly, cyber threats. And the chart you see up here at the moment puts in place some figures around cybersecurity and the risk of breaches. And I'm sure most of you have seen similar statistics before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about each of those. But I do think one of the salient facts, and one that may be surprising to most people, is the item at the bottom of the chart there. More than 99% of threats require some sort of human interaction, following a link, opening a file, etc. So whilst we think, I certainly used to think that a lot of cyber threats were just people hacking in without any human intervention at all, in most cases, data breaches take advantage of human nature, and people either not paying sufficient attention or not being aware that they're being duped in some sort of form in order to gain access to a system. And as we look in a little bit more detail at the cyber threat landscape, certain things make that risk even greater. So we're working more remotely now. We've already talked about that. The fact that implies that you're going to be using potentially more personal email or personal devices working inside your own infrastructure as opposed to within a corporate infrastructure exacerbates that risk. On this chart, I point you to the top right-hand side. Phishing schemes have grown hugely since the COVID pandemic. And phishing is targeting specific employees to click on a link, etc., and enable access to internal systems through that route. With all of the changes that we've seen, the use of personal email, personal infrastructure, etc., makes those phishing attacks more likely to be successful. And in fact, we see that C-suite and senior executives are 12 times more likely to be targeted than other members of an organization. And if you look at the bottom left, it's often the C-suite and certainly the independent board members who are using personal email and non-corporate type systems in order to do some of their work. So when you combine those two things together, there really is a huge risk that organizations need to mitigate when it comes to cybersecurity. I'm coming up to time, so I just want to make a final point about ESG, because this is an issue that we see, as I mentioned before, coming to the fore. And it's the digital transformation is not just, this is from a Deloitte study, not just about adopting new technologies. It's especially how we can use technology to create and extend to the world to a sustainable advantage. And what I mean by that is that when we use technology to look at the reporting around ESG and what companies need to provide to their investors and the broader community, there are several issues that organizations need to address. How do I collect the data that is within the organization, probably in different silos when it comes to supporting ESG disclosures? What are the requirements? What do external parties want of us when it comes to the information that we provide on ESG? And which framework should we conform to? Third-party ESG is gaining more attention. And in fact, the metrics around not just cybersecurity, but ESG compliance are likely to be metrics and scores that are used as much as other financial ratings in future when it comes to organizations and the finance that they're going to be able to garner, or the investments that are likely to be made into them. And as I said at the bottom there, multiple frameworks only make this this situation more confusing in many ways and difficult to comply with. But the good news is there are solutions out there to help address that issue. And so finally, I'll finish on the quote here, which I think is useful, which is that if we combine the best of digital transformation, it will both provide a framework for growth of businesses, but growth of businesses in a sustainable fashion that support the increasing drive for stakeholder capitalism. So that hopefully has given an indication of the sorts of things that we see organizations asking questions around, the sort of issues that the organizations are grappling with as they grow, the changes that we see in the wider world, and how organizations can take advantage of that and also mitigate the risks that go ahead, along with that. Obviously, in the Q&A, I'll be happy to focus further on any one of those factors in a little bit more detail. And just for the interest of the audience, I'll go back to the poll, because we do have the results in for the poll. And as I go back to the questions here, the results were, interestingly, A, which was improving the confidence around ESG, received 18%. B, on cybersecurity, was 32%. C, on compliance and new regulatory frameworks, 36%, and D, on board diversity and effectiveness, 14%. So what we see from the audience here, and maybe that will direct some of the questions as well, is real concern on cybersecurity and supporting new regulations. And maybe as we go through the Q&A and talking a little bit further about this topic, we can go into some of those in a little bit more detail. But that's my time up. So Pierre, happy to hand back to you to move on to the second part of the session.
Thank you, Nathan, for this very interesting presentation. I think the link with the ground we will cover now is very obvious. I hope that Jan and Joachim were able to settle their connection problem, and that they actually joined the, yes, welcome. I see Jan and Joachim. Thank you for joining this webinar. So we will cover four themes during this 3/4 of an hour webinar. The first is how companies will be affected by digital transformation. The second, I think we broached this issue, we just broached the issue, is cybersecurity. The third is financial service, digitalization of financial service, because issuers are users of financial services. And the fourth is, of course, the ESG factor. That was that Nathan broached interestingly. So let's switch first to the first theme: how will companies be impacted by digitalization? And there are two series of issues there from an issuer's vantage point. The first being how will digitalization impact corporate governance and corporate law? And the second is how will the EU strategy, especially towards SME, facilitate this uptake, notably by SMEs? Switching to the first theme first, how will it affect company law? And I think the EU has done a lot at its level, and corporate governance. So digitalization in company is not is underway for quite some years now via electronic communication. So there are two series of questions. Has it been sufficient, and have there been impediments there? And that's a question addressed to the first to the Commission representative, but also to Agostino. And second, as far as new technologies are concerned, especially DLT, distributed ledger technology, how will it impact the company's internal processes? What are the risks associated with that? And of course, there is an issue with securities ownership and the integrity of the communication. So to what extent will the European framework be impacted by this digitalization process? So that's the first series of questions addressed to the four panelists. And Jan, if you want to start with or on this subject, and then Agostino.
Thank you very much, for the invitation and for putting actually this important topic on the agenda today, because indeed I think it is in everybody's mind, and I think the digitalization has I think quite big opportunities, but of course also especially then when it comes to smaller players, also challenges in a way. So I think on our side, as you mentioned, when it comes indeed to the first topic you raised, indeed the impact of digitalization on corporate governance and corporate law, I think the EU has done quite a lot actually to facilitate introducing the electronic means and digital means into the whole corporate governance process, from let's say the submission of information to making available the information, to actually indeed structuring then the corporate governance process, virtual shareholder meetings and all the rest of it. And I think during the pandemic situation, much of this has been put in place much more and much more significantly actually than maybe one would have expected before. So on that side, I think we have enabled quite a lot. Of course, not everything depends only on European law. So there are matters which are in the national law, and there are obstacles sometimes which are at the national level, particularly when it comes to actually issues of ownership of share dematerialization of shares and other issues that are being tackled and addressed at the national level as well. So on those issues, I would be curious to see indeed from the colleagues, from Agostino and Nathan and others, indeed how they see the situation, whether actually this is whether we are on a good track or there are still obstacles from the European level here, and maybe what are also the challenges which are seen here. As to the second point which you mentioned, which is to facilitating indeed the uptake of new technologies, also distributed ledger-based technologies. How would these impact indeed the situation of companies and the company law and of the financing of companies? This is an area where indeed from the European Commission we have proposed actually legislation to set up a DLT pilot, which would precisely allow actually in the issuance of let's say the tapping of capital markets, the issuance and trading of shares actually to test the opportunities of these new technologies. And that is, I think, a legislation which is now in trilogue negotiations, and we hope this to be actually available relatively soon. This will allow, especially in the area of, let's say, smaller and less liquid, let's say, shares to test these the possibilities there, to see how, for example, distributed ledger technology can actually compress and make more efficient indeed the whole chain from let's say the issuance to the trading and settlement indeed of shares. And yes, we are very curious to see what then the practical uptake of this will be and the practical outcome. We see a lot of interest here from many member states, actually, from larger capital market and larger kind of economies, but also from many smaller ones who really hope that also the kind of cost savings which are hoped for and expected can also make indeed tapping capital markets and using capital markets more interesting, more attractive actually for smaller companies and for smaller capital markets. So we are really curious to see how this will work. All those opportunities, and I think we may come to that later on, I think indeed require, however, an increased awareness of the cyber risks. And I think that's something which has been pointed out already before. And we can come to that also again, how the balance there between, on the one hand, let's say, getting the benefits, and on the other hand, neither being, let's say, exposed to too many risks, but also not being exposed to excessive compliance burden, how this balance can actually be struck. I think there are quite good and positive ways to do that, but maybe we can come back to that later. I think I'll stop there so that we have more time for the discussion, actually.
Yeah, it's just 1 second. You're referring to the market in cyber assets or crypto assets draft directive, no?
So from the Commission side, we have presented a couple of proposals indeed. On the one hand, when it comes to actually accessing capital markets, actually, we have made 2 regulatory proposals, and that kind of takes account of the fact that some of these activities would already be covered by the existing rules for capital markets which we have. And for those, actually, if you want DLT, let's say, DLT-based traditional shares or securities, we have actually proposed a pilot, the so-called DLT pilot, which basically allows some flexibility within the existing rules to make sure that actually projects can happen and don't encounter regulatory obstacles. And then indeed, in parallel, we have proposed what we call MiCA, the Markets in Crypto Assets framework, which covers those kind of instruments which are not covered today by the existing rules. Now, I guess probably for the purposes of let's say, for the interest of indeed this audience and the topic here, probably the first of these 2 is more interesting because we probably largely, I mean, we can look in the area of ICOs or others, but probably mainly we are looking at more traditional capital market instruments. And in that sense, basically, what is more relevant and interesting is actually how can existing capital market financing be made more efficient and more cost effective, actually, especially also for smaller issuers. And those are, if you want, the proposals we made on the side of kind of gathering the opportunities. And then we complemented that on the risk side with a package of proposals to enhance the cybersecurity, actually, of all actors. That is the proposal for a new NIS directive, Networks and Information Security Directive, which covers actually cybersecurity across the board. And then a specific act on financial services, which is the so-called Digital Operational Resilience Act, or short DORA, actually, where we look particularly actually at the cyber resilience of the financial sector, which is more integrated and already more harmonized than other areas. And I think both those acts really look at cybersecurity across the economy, across the various areas, and take very much indeed a proportionate approach. I think what is very important for us is that everybody who is part of the economy today is somehow part of the networks, and everybody needs to have some basic, let's say, cyber hygiene, as we call it, in place. But very often those are very simple things. That's as simple things as a policy which has a clear instruction on how to actually deal with passwords and how to deal with phishing emails and other things. So I think a lot, that's our impression, a lot here can be actually achieved with very basic tools if they were just implemented by everybody. And then, of course, when you go to more larger companies, more complex ones, we need to look at other things, at threat-less penetration testing, at more advanced features, basically. But what we think is also very important is that with quite proportionate measures, which are not extremely cost-intensive, actually, quite a lot can actually already be achieved, and threats can be reduced by a significant amount. And that is, I think, something in the end which is in the interest of every company, given the, let's say, also increased financial impact which attacks can have.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting, Agostino. Wait. And then Joachim on the industrial strategy side. Yeah. Right.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very pleased to take part in this seminary. I'm a lawyer, so let me analyze the issue from a law point of view, at least. As far as digitalization is concerned, you have two main approaches. The first one is efficiency, so you use the digitalization to make your organization more efficient. So, for instance, you can manage, you can have a contract management which is more efficient than the physical one. You can have virtual boards. So our board is an international one, people coming from outside from Italy. So you can have more efficient meetings of the board, for instance. This is done. I mean, mainly all the companies, at least the big companies, has already adopted all the digitalized items they have for better organization, better corporate governance. The point is, if and how we can move from the vision of the efficiency to a sort of innovation. And speaking of innovation, I have in mind, at least from a legal standpoint, for instance, two main issues. The first one is predictive analysis. It's an open discussion, and you can use those tools in several moments of the company life. I was wondering to what extent we can imagine that the management of the company is at least supported by predictive analysis on the decision that the CEO is going to take. Clearly, there are already some applications in order to manage risks and to evaluate the impact on the market of some decision, but it's still the starting point, and probably on this field, and also on the impact that the influence of predictive analysis can have on the management of the company. We think we need to think more in depth and to understand all the consequences of the peculiarities. And the second point is smart contracts. There are a lot of people speaking of smart contracts. In theory, I mean, everyone knows what they are. In practice, it's not so, at least in my experience, it's not so easy to manage them. From a lawyer perspective, the smart contracts could, make the company more efficient and more sustainable. Can you imagine the impact of this kind of contracts in the relationship with the clients? If you can make automatic the application of indemnities, for instance, when we breach this law of our internet services. So we are trying to imagine to what extent we can implement such kind of contracts, which for me is, again, a strong innovation in the management of your clients, or the relationship with the clients. And finally, at least going to my experience, and again to the fact that I am a listed company in Italy, I think that there is still one area of corporate governance which is not yet coming to digitalization, and I'm speaking of the shareholders meeting. Even though we had the pandemic crisis, there was, at least in Italy, I don't know in other countries, no one which was ready to transform the physical event of the shareholders meeting into a digital event. So the result was that we didn't have the shareholders meeting. There were some simplification in the national laws that allow you to do it only with one representative of all the shareholders in a room. And so I believe that the difficulties in implementing a digital shareholders meeting are both technical on one side and legal on the other. On the technical side, probably we have all the instruments to overcome the impediments. So, just to refresh the basic moments, so meeting initialization and notification, probably a distributed ledger can help in managing this phase. Ownership record loading by the financial intermediaries, again, we can imagine a standard blockchain which connects the issuers with the banks and the other financial institutions. Voting right allocation, again, there were some experiments to token in order to attribute the right voting rights to each category of shares and so on and so forth. Voting part authentication, again, we can use a blockchain in order to be sure that the ones who is attending the shareholders meeting and voting is authorized to do that. And then the meeting management, so giving the words, opening the voting phase, closing the voting phase. We have probably all the digital items for everything, but we don't have a packed software solution which is already available in the market. We were doing some research. There are some first solutions, but not yet, let me say, standardized and ready to be used. On the legal side, my main concern is as soon as I offer the opportunity to attend through an internet connection, what happens in case the shareholder who is connected, in case the connection is interrupted, is stopped? Because clearly he will lose his right to attend the shareholders meeting. Clearly we can simplify and say, I'm offering a connection, and so the responsibility of the issuer is to assure that the platform is working well. And so in case it is the shareholders losing the connection, it's a shareholders problem. But probably on this side, we need some hard law or soft law support from the probably more than international level, at the European level, in order to be sure that we have a standard approach on this. And probably, if you look at the life of a shareholders meeting, we need to issue some guidance in order to be sure that all the companies have the same attitude towards this event. And this is something that we need, because if you imagine a solution for the relationship between the issuers and a digital solution in order to have an internet connection between the issuers and the shareholders, you can really change what is the practice now, where mostly you have one shareholders meeting a year physical, without the restriction, because you have to have all the people moving to the site. For instance, for our companies, Milan, and during the year, you don't have a strong moment of connection. Clearly, with the professional financial institution, the company speaks a lot, but with all the other shareholders, there are no other moments of confrontation, of discussion, and so on and so forth. So this is something that can change the paradigm of the relationship between the issuers and the shareholders. That's my point of view.
Right, okay. Now, I have further question, but let Joachim perhaps take the floor. Yes.
Thank you, Pierre. On top of what has already been said, I would like to add indeed more the industrial, but mainly also the SME perspective. And from our industrial policy perspective, we have taken an approach which is more encompassing than the traditional sectorial approach, we now define 14 ecosystems. And all these ecosystems have to undergo the twin green and digital transition, which is why we're currently working on what we call pathways in order to identify the common problems that people in these ecosystems and organizations and companies face and how to solve the issues. The ecosystem perspective is very important because it also includes the value chain, it includes all the sourcing of inputs, but it also includes all the services. So for example, we have a mobility ecosystem, construction ecosystem, proximity, etc. One of the 14 ecosystems is the digital ecosystem as such. The other 13 are other ecosystems, but it's very important to understand that digital here, or digitalization, is special because all 14 ecosystems need to have a digital dimension in these pathways. Because digitalization offers a lot of opportunities and many of the features are common, although of course there are big differences. From the SME side, as you know, more than 98% of our enterprises in Europe are SMEs. We have 23 million. And what we are talking here most is a fraction of these SMEs that indeed have experience with capital markets or are involved in ongoing transactions or raising finance there. We want to increase that, obviously. But there are huge differences in Europe. And in the SME strategy of last year, especially with a view to breakthrough technologies such as blockchain, we have identified two key areas where we want to have actions, and we have followed up on this. And the first is education, and the second is access to finance. Maybe I start with education. And this has actually become very much more important, especially under the Pact for Skills, which we launched last November. And actually, wherever you are located, in which ecosystem or which size you have as a company, or even when you think that you are non-digital and don't want to use the digital opportunities as such, we have identified a number of features where it is extremely important that you acquire digital skills and target your whole organization at least avoiding certain risks and grasping certain opportunities. And we have identified three parts of the digital universe, I would like to say, where digital education or digital skills apply to every company. The first is data, because that is the starting point of the whole digitalization. You own your data. You are responsible for, let's say, helping to protect them. You give right to access, etc. So starting from the GDPR to the upcoming Data Act, we have a whole pipeline of initiatives on data storage, data transfer, fairness in this context, etc., where every company, regardless where it is, needs to have a strategy on this. The second point that we identified, and it has been discussed already, is cybersecurity. And cybersecurity, for the reasons discussed and others, apply to everyone. And there you need to have a 100% security. It doesn't help you if 99% of your organization know the risks and deal with them. If you have one person that pushes the wrong button, you have a problem. And therefore, this is a key issue. The third thing, and this, I think, nicely relates to the broader discussion here, is what I call crowd management. And crowd management needs to apply in each and every context. Crowd management is about the composition of your board. It is about the relations to your stakeholders. But crowd management goes much deeper, because in the digital domain, your crowd management is completely different than in the non-digital domain, in the sense that interaction becomes much more direct, becomes much less channeled through intermediaries, and becomes much more linked with all areas. So that from the sourcing of inputs to the access to markets, the innovation generation, the finance, etc., all of these are integrated processes that ultimately lead us to what we call the token economy, where blockchain then as a breakthrough technology plays a key role. And the second point in the SME strategy is finance, which, as just said, is a key integral part for that. And finance is also broader than what we normally envisage, but there are two elements for that. I would say that what blockchain does is, on the one hand side, it, beyond the creation of trust and security, is that it leads to all these tremendous efficiency gains that have been well discussed. And this is where I think most traditional capital markets now focus upon, so that we have not only in the area of financial instruments, but also in the upcoming crypto assets, etc., a sort of focus on these aspects from the intermediary side, but also from the bigger investor sides, the institutional investors, etc. And at the same time, we have the majority of SMEs, we have the majority of retail investors who operate very much locally, but are enabled by this technology to compete suddenly globally with much bigger companies because the whole block of fixed costs that normally exist in these transactions falls away, and they have this much more direct interaction with the crowd, also with the financial part. And this brings us then more to areas like decentralized finance and everything else that is currently being discussed, where then the MiCA regulation applies. Fundamental point in this is that not only the organizations and the investors, but also the regulators have to learn. Because the one underlying feature of these processes, and this brings us a bit to the governance in my view, is that this innovation is coming with an unprecedented pace. And it's not only all the waves of information in blockchain, in AI, in all these related parts, but also the interconnections, which means that the traditional governance model, in my opinion, doesn't apply any longer, where you had mature markets, limited number of incumbents, you could take years in order to govern. And now you have to adopt a much more flexible, innovative approach in order to govern these things, to make use of the opportunities. And there we face the issue, as Jan has, of course, very well explained, that as the Commission, we have very early embraced the opportunities of distributed ledger technology. We have declared already more than 5 years ago that we see the future of the European economy in all the areas in blockchain as one of the 4 breakthrough technologies that we identified. But this whole innovation comes now on top of already existing legislation and regulation, which brings us to the question of what to do. And there, indeed, the approach that we take is, on the one hand side, we open up the opportunity for co-learning between the enterprises, the investors, but also the regulators through, for example, the pilot regime and through other projects that we are doing. And a further element in this context here is, of course, that we need to see, because we take a technology-neutral approach, what we have to change stepwise in order to allow for the uptake of blockchain in very detailed things. So, for example, and Jan can explain that much better than I do, on a number of things we get the advice from ESMA and others. And this, I would say, is a very, smooth approach, in a sense that we do not intend to radically change our approach, but we need to make sure that there's nothing written which prevents the uptake of innovative new technology. But the bottom line, and there I should probably conclude, is indeed that the initiative must be at the enterprise level, because suddenly through this digitalization, also in terms of finance, through crypto assets, tokenization, tokenized machines that fully integrate the pipeline of services, etc., there is a broad range of tools available for the companies to raise capital and to also give the profits gained in the process of production, etc., to the investors much more smoothly, so that they have the choice, and they have also a bigger choice of entities and intermediaries that try to apply these opportunities. And therefore, it is for, I would say, the legacy system, for the existing intermediaries, indeed, to take this up, because if they don't, then they face the problem of this big new part of emerging finance as such. And this is why the discussion that we're having today on these areas are so important. But bottom line, again, the 3 main things in this digitalization domain: manage your data, protect against cyber risks, and manage your crowd, because that is where your opportunities come from.
Many thanks for this very interesting presentation. But if I understand you rightly, you follow both a non-regulatory approach within DG GROW and a regulatory approach elsewhere in the Commission. Because one of the concerns by European issuers was the access of simplifying and reducing the cost of access for SMEs to capital markets. So but that's followed by various departments within the Commission. But you've mentioned both the non-regulatory and the regulatory dimension of this.
I must say we work together on this very smoothly within the Commission, and Jan might to add to this. But from DG GROW's perspective, we take more the demand perspective. We see a very big potential in indeed what we call the token economy. Decentralized finance allows for much new governance structures, and the approach that you've seen from the Commission so far complements the two. You indeed have the package that Jan has already mentioned last year, where we have made certain changes already in existing regulation. On top came MiCA and the pilot regime, and we, of course, exactly did MiCA and the encompassing pieces of regulation and legislation, because we say that these are not financial instruments. We have financial instruments,
right,
and we have the whole token universe, and we need to work on both.
right. Thank you very much. I'm sorry we are running out of time. We have 15 minutes left before the Q&A session. Could we broach the three other issues? And on cybersecurity, I have one additional question always from the issuer's vantage point, is how to strike a balance between cybersecurity, the security, and the inherent transparency of corporate law. The problem in case of cybersecurity breach is that you might breach the confidentiality of internal of company information, and it has an impact, for example, on the market abuse requirements. So how strike this balance? I think it will have an impact. So that's one question. The key question I have from the issuer's perspective, and then we could switch, if you agree, to the financial services digitalization that Jan broached in its introductory presentation. On cybersecurity, how do you think these cybersecurity requirements fit with the transparency of corporate law? Is that where to strike the balance? Agostino. Right.
Okay, so cybersecurity is quite a complex issue, because there are two main levels of intervention. All the nations are experiencing special cyber perimeters where they are putting all the strategical assets of the nation, and in this perimeter you have higher standards in terms of assets, hardware and software, and constant monitoring and immediate support in case of attack. And then you have the private side of the medal, so the private companies, which, if I may, are quite alone. The issue of the cyber security is that is something new, because you have a number of attacks which is huge. The type of attacks is completely different from the physical attack. So you have people somewhere in the world and you don't know from where they come from. Everything is cross-country and very speed. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure that what we have implemented so far is not sufficient. Companies are alone. They don't know how to manage the risk. Probably they don't want to report that they've been subject to attacks. Okay, there are some legal obligation in terms of privacy in case there is a theft of data of your clients, and clearly this is the main problem. For instance, we have had an attack in July, and the first reaction of my CEO was, please do not make it public. But we were forced by the privacy law to communicate to our clients, to a part of those of our clients which were affected by the data stolen of the event, and so there was a report in the press. And I believe that, I mean, we need something more and something new. Also, if you think at what does a company do in case of attack, you have to report to the police. You do a standard report to a standard police office, then the police has to start the investigation. Everything is very slow compared to the speediness of the attack. And in addition, you know, the national police cannot do nothing because the attacks come from somewhere in the world. So probably we need something new. And we know we also need to give up, so to change what we have in the law in order to make the reaction more effective. First of all, I was wondering whether we have an international convention. I was looking for we have international convention for everything, but I was looking on the website whether there was an international convention promoted by the OECD or someone in order to have a standard definition of the crimes and enhance the cooperation between the state organization and the police organization, and I was not able to find. There are some initiatives on the OECD and the EU level. There are a lot of discussion. There are initiatives called Build Confidence, which are very welcome, but probably we need something more in order to be sure that companies that are attacked, they can immediately report and they have immediate support from the authorities in order to manage the attack. Probably we need dedicated point of contacts where you can immediately report the situation and be assisted. And the other point is, when it comes to the economics of the company, cybersecurity is mainly a combination of, on one side you need to have up-to-date software and hardware, and on the other side we have CapEx limitations. So again, is there a way to support the investments in hardware and software in order to prevent the cyber attacks? I don't know, tax credits or whatever kind of investment, because I feel that if the company are left alone, probably, not all the company has the magnitude of CapEx in order to support the update software and hardware evolution. On the other hand, the other risk is, the risk of the cybersecurity increases with proportionally to the number of people that access a platform, a data storage. And clearly, on the one side, you have the business that insists in having a large number of people accessing data in order to make the business more effective and more speed. On the other hand, you have an increased risk because normally, the point is to breach the platform and the data through capturing the password and of a guy. And so the larger is the number of the people accessing, and the higher is the risk of a cyber attack. And again, there is a sort of fight between the lawyer and the security guys who are insisting in reducing the number of people accessing, and the business who is insisting on enlarging this number. So again, this is something that we need to solve in order to make the company safer. This is at least my point of view.
Right. Thank you very much for sharing your information, and we will have to think about more in depth to that issue within European issuers. Indeed, can I switch now with 8 minutes left until the Q&A session to one very specific question concerning digitalization of financial services. The question is, it's about the Central Securities Depository Regulation, which is underway, and which is, I would say, close to European issuers' heart on two grounds. Because first, they acknowledge the notary function of the Central Security Depository, and ensures that in that way the integrity of the issue. And the second issue, which is close to issuers' concern, is that using trusted third parties such as the CSD ensures security of ownership. And in other words, you cannot challenge the ownership of the investor when you go through a third party. So my question is very specific, is to what extent, because the Commission has not yet released its proposal, and that's perhaps a question to Jan, its proposal to review the regulation. To what extent will the use of DLT be taken into account for instance, on the issue with respect to the issue of securities ownership, which is currently validated through a trusted third party, that is meaning a CSD. So to what extent will the DLT dimension be taken into account under the review of CSDR? So that was my very specific question.
Yeah, thanks very much. No, this is indeed, I think you rightly pointed to the very important function of central securities depositories actually as trusted third parties. And I mean, there's no, I think, there will not be any fundamental change on this when we review the CSD regulation. Indeed, I think but that's already on the table. What I think we are, let's say, what we want to do is we want to enable for smaller, less liquid issuances in the context of this DLT pilot. We want to enable some testing and allow some regulatory flexibility actually for projects which indeed integrate, let's say, trading and settlement functions. But that is indeed a kind of quite limited setup, and is indeed a possibility to test, not a fundamental change of, let's say, the role of CSDs, which are, of course, transacting, as you know, billions and billions of transactions, and they have an enormous volume and enormous responsibility actually for indeed the settlement of shares, and that is, I think, something which a function which certainly from the Commission's CSDR review will not change. So I think this review is let's say, will look at a number of, let's say, targeted adjustments of the rules to indeed to improve the functioning of the regime. You know, this is were new rules which, when they were introduced, I think in 2004, it was a completely new set of European rules, and so it is only natural that we, in a way, review how they worked, where there need to be targeted improvements indeed of their working.
Right. Thank you very much for this confirmation. Can we switch very shortly to the fourth theme, which was broached at the outset of this webinar, ESG? So as Nathan mentioned, it will help channel, digitalization will help channel the funds for sustainable will help channel sustainable financing towards ESG related project. And that I have a question to Agostino to conclude our webinar on this aspect. What are to what extent will it facilitate? And linked to that, I have a more general question with the additional layers imposed on companies through the whole sustainable finance framework, including SFDR, including the taxonomy, including the benchmark regulation. To what extent, on the one side, will it make the matter of reporting by companies more complex? And to what extent will the digitalization alleviate that increasingly complex reporting environment? That's a difficult question for you, Agostino, but I think that's more or less the crux of the matters now for issuers, which are confronted to a very rapidly changing environment. Thank you. If you could keep it short for the until 12, yes. Thank you.
No, I will. So for sure, you know, the additional reporting is heavy. And but to be very frank with you, at least if I look at my experience, probably most of the biggest issuers, we were already adopting voluntary ESG disclosures. Clearly, the voluntary one were not so detailed as the one provided by the new law. But frankly speaking, we are not facing a major impact on the reporting side. And you were right, we have already digital tools that support the collection of the data and the creation of the report. So frankly, you know, it's not something which is affecting mostly the companies, at least the biggest one. If I may, just one comment and then I stop myself. I mean, I'm not so sure that the imposing a reporting obligation and some regulatory framework is the right way. The real point is here to increase the perception of the ESG as a business opportunity with some economic return more than you are obliged to do something. On this point, clearly finance is doing a great job, because finance is more and more attributing funds to ESG companies, or at least is saying they are preferred investment. And also on the equity side, the big equity investors are more interested in ESG companies. So this way is, for me at least, better than the regulatory way.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you for this very fruitful, productive discussion. Time was too short, obviously. And now if we switch to the Q&A session, who wants among the participants take the floor? I think the question has to be put in writing, I think. Wait, no. Otherwise, I have one question on corporate governance to Agostino on the to the extent to what extent will corporate governance be impacted by digitalization? I'm referring to the automation of internal company decision-making processes, facilitating the enforcement of corporate governance decision or norms. Is that an issue, or is that something that...
probably is the new frontier, and I don't think that, at least if I look at the Italian experience, we don't have such tools, and we are not experiencing such issue. As I was saying, when you look at those kind of tools and the future of the, you can extend this discussion to everything. For instance, again, looking at my experience as a lawyer, who is going to decide the litigation, a judge or an algorithm? Or in medicine, if there is a disease, who is going to take a decision about the intervention? A guy, a physical guy, or an algorithm? I tend to believe that finally the management of the company will stay in the board, will stay in the CEO. But again, I believe that those tools can help in managing the risk, in at least supporting the decision. Clearly, the point is, what happens if the decision of the board is completely different from any outcome of the digitalized tool is suggesting? Do we need to motivate the way we decide, or is something that we can ignore and go ahead? There is nothing in the legislation, at least to the best of my knowledge, and there's something that we have to better dig. I prefer finally physical management and people decision. I'm probably conservative. They can help, but they are a substitute.
Okay.
Maybe, Pierre, I could add something to that, just from what we see practically around digitalization and transformation. I think we often see organizations having to balance two things. On one hand, you've got adhering to regulation and ensuring cybersecurity, which are two of the biggest concerns from the audience today.
Yes,
and on the other hand, how do we take advantage of greater speed of governance that's needed today, and what tools are there to support that? So that could be things such as digital sign-off of motions that are done today, faster meetings of executive teams, but at the same time balancing that with the regulation cyber requirements. And then when you think further as to governance and the way that organizations need to report on governance isn't just within the walls of that organization, as Joachim was saying. You look at the full supply chain now, and the wider community for which reporting has to be done. Yeah, I have huge sympathy with issuers who are trying to strike that balance. The technology is certainly out there to do that, but you've always got to have those two sides of the equation in mind, and that applies to pretty much every topic that we've talked about today. And I think it's a real fine line to tread, but the ability is there to do that, and digitization gives organizations a chance to take advantage of that while striking that balance. But I think that's really one of the key issues that organizations have to address today.
Right. Any further question or? On ESG, I had a last question about since we are dealing with the digitalization of industry, the circular electronic initiative by the EU, which is still at its beginning. Will it serve? So the emphasis is on product regulation, or is it this type of approach which will be followed to fulfill the objective of the circular economy taxonomy in the future? So more emphasis on the product itself, the recycling of the product, and more emphasis on the supply chain. Is that an approach which is, my impression is that it's still tentative, and that's the technical platform which has to adopt standard level 2 measures is not clear about that, but perhaps you have a better insight on that, Nathan. Is that something which is which will pave the way for a future standard setting process under the taxonomy regulation?
Yeah, I would allow others to talk about the specific regulatory changes that are likely to come through that. In practice, the struggle that we see issuers having today with ESG is pressure from different third parties when it comes down to an organization's sustainability record and its broader environmental social governance record as well. And that comes from the employees themselves. People want to work for organizations that have purpose these days, and purpose is much broader than just making profit, in my opinion. Secondly, the investment community being driven by the need for greater sustainability and environmental credentials around products that they put together. And so therefore they are looking at issuers to be able to demonstrate the governance, the environmental social measures that they're putting in place as well. And so SFDR has a big implication there, not just for players in the financial market, but for issuers. The ripple effect on issuers will be strong. And I think that the other thing that's very confusing in the ESG world at the moment is just the plethora of frameworks that people are being asked to conform to. So if I'm an issuer, I'm in the middle of all this. I've got various stakeholders who say, I demand that you have purpose. I demand that you demonstrate your credentials here. I've got regulators on one hand saying, provide the information to demonstrate this. I have investors asking the same. And there is, I think, a strong requirement. And I was rather surprised in a way that only 18% of the poll said that ESG was high, the highest priority. I think if we did this poll again in 6 months, a year's time, that would rank more highly. But I think there's definitely a need at the moment for organizations to be able to harness the data they had, go back to Joachim's first point, understand your data, and then being able to transform and deliver that in a way that satisfies those various requirements. There is technology out there to do that, but understanding and putting in place a methodology such that you're supporting those various demands is a tricky thing right now, and I think we'll see more of that in future.
Okay, and digitalization might help, so that closes
central to it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if I might.
Thank you very much to everyone, and can I just remind you that you will be asked to comment on this webinar, to answer a small survey of a few questions, and if you could please spend 1 minute to do that. And I think it was, for me at least, very interesting, but of course we didn't have enough time to broach through the whole issue. Thank you very much, and to the panelists and to all who attended this webinar. Goodbye.